I know you were born a Southern Baptist and you had a conversion to Catholicism in 2009, right? Is that right?
That's right.
I know that, that conversion took some time, and your wife was really instrumental in that as well. Do you want to share a little bit about, I guess, your background growing up as a young boy, as a Southern Baptist, and then your introduction to Catholicism?
Well, I'd grown up in the Army. My dad was a career soldier. And so you tended to be whatever the local chaplain was. I think I was at one point an acolyte for a Presbyterian chaplain, for example. I was a Baptist, and then I married Callista, who was a cradle Catholic and who had grown up very devout in a small town in Wisconsin, and had ended up singing in the choir of the Basilica of the National Shrine. So I would go out with her for rehearsals, and I would go on Sundays to the Basilica, which is a magnificent place and has an amazing music program.
Oh, yeah.
And I went with the choir to Rome, where they were doing some recordings. And while the choir was rehearsing and recording, I would hang out with Monsignor Rossi, who's the rector of the Basilica. And we would talk about the role of religion and what was happening to our civilization, and the central role of the Catholic Church in protecting and defending that civilization. And so that had sort of got me thinking a lot. And then when Pope Benedict came to visit the United States, he had a gathering of all the bishops at the Basilica and for Vespers, which my wife participated in as part of the choir. And we, those of us who were spouses, were allowed to sit upstairs in the main church. And when Pope Benedict came in, he came in through the main church, and he had such a look of joy in his eyes that it made me think, I really want to be part of that. And so that night at dinner at the rectory with Monsignor Rossi, I said, I really want to convert. I'm now convinced. So I spent a year studying with Monsignor Rossi.
Oh, nice.
And then Cardinal Wuerl received me into the church, and it's been an amazing journey ever since. And of course, my wife went on to become the ambassador of the Vatican. And I'm talking to you this week. We will go back to Rome for the seventh year in a row of having Christmas Eve Mass at St. Peter's. So I think it's fair to say that we're pretty committed.
I had read, I guess Pope Benedict came 2008, and then you were introduced to his book, right? The Jesus of Nazareth. Now, I know that you're a scholar and you're a thinker, and that's a pretty heavy book. I had my own I didn't have a conversion, but I had a reversion, and that was one of the first books I read, trying to understand the teachings of the church and really trying to discover who Jesus is. So I know that was a pivotal book for you, right? I mean, you read that book.
Well, Pope Benedict was one of the greatest theologians of his generation, and a remarkably studied man. And he, you're right, he tended not to write in simple ways. So you have to, part of it, I think, being German. So you have to actually work your way through it. But it's an exhilarating, if you're interested in the intellectual life of the mind, then Benedict is a remarkable figure.
And you're right. It was a very, very heavy book. I had to really read that slowly and really try to comprehend paragraph by paragraph.
Well, there are some books that are designed to be read one paragraph at a time. You read it and you have to stop. You have to think about it, lock it down, and then go to the next one. We were very fortunate when Callista was the ambassador. He had retired, but we had an opportunity to visit with him, and it turned out that they both studied piano. And so they had this whole conversation about music that I would not have imagined ever having with a former pope.
I know that when you were going to the Basilica and sitting there and listening to your wife sing and whatnot, I know that's something that drew you in. I'd read that the Eucharist had a profound impact on you, just understanding the real presence of Jesus. Can you share a little bit of that, what that was like for the first time?
I think it was the understanding that in the Protestant tradition, the Eucharist represents the representation of Jesus. But in the Catholic tradition, it is the representation of the actual body. And that makes it a very different communal experience and a very much more profound relationship with God inherent in the process, and explains why, for Catholics, having communion is so extraordinarily important.
When you left your Baptist, I guess was there anybody in your family that was disappointed or upset at you, or was there any kind of conflict with your family regarding that?
There was no conflict. I think there was a sense of understanding that I had been evolving, and they were pretty used to my being my own person anyway.
That's awesome, and you've been a Catholic ever since.
Yes. Well, I'm talking to you, and this week we leave for Rome.
Happy for you. That's exciting. So tell me a little bit about your political career. Why did you end up going into politics early on in your career?
My dad was a career soldier. I was born in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. He'd been in the Korean War. He'd been briefly in World War II, and then he was in the Korean War. And when he came back, we went to Fort Riley, Kansas for 3 years when I was a kid. And then we went to Orléans, France, and Stuttgart, Germany. While we were in Orléans, excuse me, we visited a friend of his who had been captured by the Japanese in the Philippines, served on the Bataan Death March, and spent 3.5 years in a Japanese prison camp. And he had now been given an assignment by the Army because his health had been broken in the prison camp. So he basically had a job as a captain, being billeted at Verdun, but not doing very much. So we went to visit him. Verdun is the largest battlefield in the Western Front of World War I. About 600,000 French and German soldiers died in a 9-month period. And they built huge amounts of railroads and concrete and bunkers and storage facilities. An amazing amount of money on both sides, an amazing number of lives on both sides went into Verdun. They have a building called the Ossuary, which has the bones of the 100,000 people who were blown apart by artillery and lay in the fields rotting and couldn't be identified. And so you can go to the Ossuary. In fact, a few years back, I took Callista and we went and toured the battlefield again. It was as formidable as I thought it was at the time. So we were spending 3 days touring this extraordinary battlefield and 3 nights listening to my father's friend talk about the cost of defeat. And we left there, went back to Orléans, and were in Orléans when the French paratroopers came back from Algeria and killed the French Fourth Republic, brought General de Gaulle back from his home at Costabile des Églises, and created the Fifth Republic. Then shortly after that, we were transferred to Stuttgart, which was the 7th Army headquarters. And the week we arrived in Stuttgart was the first Berlin crisis and was a war in Lebanon where the U.S. Army went in to sustain the government, and we had tactical nuclear weapons offshore. All of that came together in my head to say, this stuff's all real. Countries can die. And the quality of your leadership is really central to whether or not you're going to survive. And I decided in August of 1958, that I was 15 years old, that I would basically have 3 jobs. 1, what do we have to do to survive? 2, how do we explain it to the American people so that they will give us permission to do it? And 3, when we have permission, how do you actually implement it so it works? And I would say that from August of 58 on, that's all I've done with my career. So it's been about 65 years.
Wow. So that planted a seed of really service. You really wanted to serve your country and really trying to make a difference. My earliest recollection of you is obviously Speaker of the House in the 90s. You were Speaker of the House from 95 to 98, right? And Bill Clinton was the president. When I was thinking about that today, that's almost 30 years ago. I mean, you were a younger man then, and it's a long time ago. And do you have any recollection of that period regarding what were really moments that were like, yeah, we did it, or moments that you were disappointed about, or can you share?
Joe Gaylord, who was my partner in trying to get this done, and I spent 16 years growing a majority. And when we won in 1994, it was the first House Republican majority in 40 years. When we got reelected in 96, it was the first reelected House Republican majority since 1928.
Wow, I didn't know that.
We wrote a book on it called March to the Majority, which outlines all the things we had to do to basically change history. And that's what we were doing. When we won, we negotiated with Clinton. And because we had won so decisively, we had the moral advantage. And we got welfare reform, the biggest capital gains tax cut in history. We balanced the budget for 4 straight years for the only time in your lifetime. So it was a very intense, I think, very effective period. But we couldn't change the culture of our party. We couldn't teach them how to be a team. Same problem that Thatcher had and that Reagan had. And so once I left, they forgot the step. What we were doing was basically Reaganism. We stood on Reagan's shoulders. And I first started studying Reagan in 1965. I first worked with him in 1974. I helped in the 80 campaign as a congressman. I worked with him for 8 years. So I was carrying the principles and the patterns that had worked for Reagan into the Congressional Republican Party. And I was doing it consciously. I mean, I understood that these were principles. It was like being a cookbook. When I left, people reverted to the norm, which is very short-sighted, very tactical, still true today. And I think Speaker McCarthy tried to break out of it and got fired as a result because there's a self-destructive wing of the party which would rather commit suicide than be successful.
I mean, your career has been amazing. You met and worked with so many people. Is there anyone that strikes out to you that was really inspirational, transformative in working with them, and you realize at that moment that this is a very special person?
Well, I mean, there were 2 people who I never met, but who had a huge impact. One was Washington, about whom I've written 3 novels, and the other was Lincoln, about whom I've written 4 novels. And I studied both of them very intensely. And then I would say in people, it's hard to overstate how really good Reagan was. And when you had the period of Reagan and Prime Minister Thatcher of Britain and Pope John Paul II, you had 3 leaders who were astonishing, saw each other as a team. When Reagan and the Pope met, they had both been shot. They were both actors. The Pope had been an actor before he became a priest. They were both dedicated anti-communist. And they really forged an alliance, along with Thatcher, that ultimately brought down the Soviet Union. If you think about it, it's one of the great historic feats to take an enormously powerful country and get it to change without a major war.
It seems like times have really changed. Have you noticed when you were involved as Speaker of the House and politics then very different than what it is today?
Yeah, I mean, it's different in some ways and the same in others. I mean, you can study Julius Caesar or you can study British politics in the 18th century. I mean, in the end, politics is really about the leadership of people. It occurs in cultural forms and cultural patterns, and different countries, different civilizations have different patterns. I was probably helped a great deal by becoming a historian because it gave me the chance and the excuse to immerse myself in a lot of other places and trying to understand the lessons of how people exercise power and what people do with it. One of the biggest changes is the rise of the internet because it allows people who are extremists in both parties to become important to a niche group of followers who send them money. So you can't have an effective discipline because they can actually do fine by being on TV and then raising money, and they each become their own little kingdom, if you will. And that, I think, has made the Congress a little harder to lead than it would have been 20 or 30 years ago.
So during your conversion years, I know that you were influenced by several books, one of which was George Weigel's The Cube and the Cathedral, which is about the crisis of secularism in Europe, and his book about the final revolution. And this is the role about Christianity in freeing Eastern Europe from atheistic dictatorship. So what do you think about that in today's world? It seems that he was onto something.
Sure. Look, I think everybody who is sustained by Western civilization is under siege. One wing of the siege is Islamic radicalism, and the other wing is a anti-religious, secular dictatorship that emphasizes decadence and self-fulfillment and hedonism. Between the two of them, I think this is a genuine fight for the survival of civilization.
So do you think there's a resurgence of Marxist ideology today?
Well, only in a very broad sense, not in the Leninist communist sense, but the degree to which there's an underlying belief that you can't have objective standards is just astonishing. And you see it right now in the fight over the survival of Israel. I mean, there's a poll that just came out today that a majority of people under 25 think that Israel should disappear and that Hamas should inherit the territory. Now, that is such an extraordinary swing from what everybody over 25 believes that you have to really wonder how much of it's a function of an education system which is anti-Semitic and anti-American.
Can you elaborate a little more on that?
Sure. You've had 2 or 3 generations now of teachers who teach things that are lies, but who get promoted and get tenure because they believe the lies. And so you have, I think, a totally distorted sense of how the world works. I tell people that one of the great problems of modern liberalism is that they saw The Lion King and thought it was a documentary. And so they think that lions and zebras sing and dance together. And when we try to convince them that lions actually eat zebras, they tell us, no, that can't be true. Didn't you ever see the movie? And so you end up with, a culture which tolerates fentanyl is a culture committing suicide. A culture which tolerates children being taught that beheading babies is okay if there's a good cause is a culture that's committing suicide. If you look, for example, at the attacks on Santa Claus, literally attacks, people getting beaten up for wearing a Santa Claus costume, what you're seeing is a civilization under siege. And at some point, either the civilization will die or it will counterattack, reassert itself, and impose change.
Do you feel that our country is pushing, let's say, the belief of a God or just the ideology that God doesn't exist? I mean,
sure. But look, if you were to look at for example, the grants that the Biden administration is making, or if you were to look at the belief system of the dancers that Dr. Jill brought to the White House to do a Christmas dance, they have a full page on being anti-white, for example. You just go down the list, and there's no question in my mind that there is an active effort by large elements of the bureaucracy and an active element by the professors that we pay for with tax money to undermine and destroy American civilization as it has existed now for over 250 years.
What is the motivating factor for all this? Why do you think?
I think part of it's self-hatred. Part of it is that if you believe in certain ideological beliefs, you get taught, for example, that slavery is all about being white, and so you don't pay any attention to Arab slave traders or African slave traders or Native American slave traders. I mean, none of that. That's also politically incorrect. You can't imagine trying to actually teach a class on slavery throughout history. To give you an example, I've always been fascinated by it, and I don't know if it's still there or not. But the Miami Science Museum used to have a miniature statue of a skin doctor. And a skin doctor was a person in the Aztec tradition who wore the flayed skins of the sacrifices until they rotted off and would have layers of human skins. Now, I suspect that that's so politically incorrect that if you were to try to give a lecture on the role of human sacrifice and skin doctors in Aztec civilization, you would get booed off the Yale or Harvard campus. Because it can't be, it's my point about the Lion King, it can't be true. If that were true, then they would be humans too. Then they would have the weaknesses and the problems that all humans have. Well, that can't be right, because we are less than they are. And that's where it starts.
You produced a film actually with your wife, 9 Days That Changed the World, that really touches upon a lot of the things that we're discussing right now. It was about the fall of communism, but it deal with the fight against the culture of Marxism. And you want to share a little? I know it was a while ago. I think it was 2010 you released that film?
Yeah. What happened was we were making we've made 9 documentaries so far, and are just now filming a series called Journey to America, which is about legal immigrants who come here and make America a better place. Because we want to balance off anti-illegal immigration with pro-legal immigration. So we were doing a film about Ronald Reagan. And part of what we wanted to shoot was the impact he had on communism. So we ended up going to Gdansk and interviewing Lech Walesa, who had been the leader of the Solidarity movement in undermining the Polish communist dictatorship. And then we went down and we saw Václav Havel, who had been the spokesperson for freedom in that what was then Czechoslovakia, now the Czech Republic. And in both places, they said, the really decisive moment was before Reagan was elected. It was John Paul II coming back to Poland. Now, Callista's half Polish, as well as devoutly Catholic. So by the time Havel got done, I turned to her, I said, I guess this means we're making a movie. And so we decided we'd make a movie about Pope John Paul II. We went to Rome, to Krakow, back to Gdansk. And I think it's an amazing movie. The Cardinal Dolan, for example, uses it in his catechism classes. I just saw a young seminarian whose seminary had watched it just recently. And all of our films are available online, so people can watch them. And that's probably the one I'm proudest of, because what happened was Vince Haley, who was our key researcher and advisor, had found out that the Polish Catholic Church distrusted the Soviet media, and so they'd given out cameras and had lots of people who had these small handheld cameras, and they had hundreds and hundreds of hours of film that nobody had ever seen before of John Paul II in Poland. And so we actually had made Vince stay in Poland to negotiate to get the rights to the film. And as you can imagine, the Polish Catholic authorities distrusted lawyers in general. Their experience of the Soviet lawyers had been pretty bad. And they kept saying, why are we going to allow this American to have this? And Vince was supposed to get married, and we said, you can't come back till you get the film. And so he stayed there an extra couple of weeks, got the permission. And when you see the movie, you're literally seeing footage shot by local Polish Catholics of the Pope. It's amazingly powerful footage. You're hearing the Pope talk. He was an extraordinary orator. And that very first day, he is in what was then called Victory Square. I think it's now called Pilsudski Square, but it was the Soviet term. He's in Victory Square in Warsaw with 3 million people. And he talks about God shining on the face of Poland. And there's this great moment where somebody says to us in the film, this was a real interview, that they looked around and they suddenly realized there were a lot more of them than there were of the secret police. So why were they supposed to be afraid of the secret police?
Yeah, I rented it last night and I watched it. And was it on Amazon? I can't remember where I rented it. And it's extraordinary. I mean, it's really like a history lesson. So much stuff is packed in this film. And but now it makes sense when you're describing it's sort of like a lot of black and white footage, right? That's sort of like you could see. That's
shot by local Catholics.
Yeah, it's so cool. It's so cool. I don't know if I asked you this. Did you ever meet St. John Paul?
I met him twice. Once as speaker. And I was there as a very junior congressman in 79 when he came to the White House to see Jimmy Carter.
Did you get a little bit of a chance to engage with him a little bit, or?
Well, I got to chat with him twice when I was a congressman. And then Callista, we went over with the choir, and they were supposed to meet with him, but he was in the hospital. So they stood outside the hospital singing.
Wow.
At his window. And it was very touching. And there was a Polish choir also there. And I mean, it was very, very meaningful and very humbling.
I mean, that's a man that had amazing gifts.
Yes.
He's an orator, like you had said, an actor, a communicator.
Well, and of course, Weigel wrote a brilliant biography of him. So anybody who's listening to us who wants to, if you go get George Weigel's biography, you'll begin to realize how truly extraordinary John Paul II was.
Yeah. Give us your insight for, we got, 2024 is going to be election year. Talk about things being very divisive in our own country. Where's the hope? How do you see this next year unfolding politically?
Well, I just saw polling numbers this morning that Trump is now at, I think, 69% among Republicans. And Karl Rove, who's not particularly for Trump, was on TV saying, look, nobody who's at 69% has ever failed to win the nomination. So I think Trump will be the Republican nominee. I think at the rate things are going now, he'll probably be the next president. And I think that will represent an enormous challenge to the old order. I think the degree to which they are terrified of Trump, and I think correctly so, I think Trump represents real change, a real return to basic American values, and a willingness to take on both the universities, the news media, and the bureaucracy. And I think those folks are panic-stricken for good reason.
Historically, you would know that I was speaking to my wife. Has this ever happened where a president lost the election on his second term and then was reelected on
Grover Cleveland won in 1880, lost in 1884, won in 1880. I'm sorry. He won in 84, lost in 88, won in 92.
Wow. The only time it ever happened historically?
The only time it's ever happened.
Wow.
In fact, I've told Trump he ought to put Grover Cleveland's picture up on the wall.
Is there anything that you'd like to share? I know that you guys you mentioned a little about this film that you're working on. Is there anything else that you want to share?
I would just say to people, if you're interested, we do a lot of things. Callista does an article every week. I do 3 newsletters a week and 3 podcasts a week. All of them are free. We also write books. The most recent one I mentioned was March to the Majority. And if they go to Gingrich 360, they'll see the scale of what we're doing and how many different things we're trying to do.
That's awesome.
And we have a very small team, but it works really, really hard. And we're deliberately very broad. We try to impact the culture and impact politics and be helpful to the Republicans in trying to figure out strategies that bring together the maximum number of people. I think I personally believe, as Reagan did, you want to try to get 60 or 70% on your side so you have a working majority that can actually get something done, and that's what we focus on. Is
there a retirement ever in your future? I know that you just hit 80, right?
Well, not if my health holds up. I mean, I love doing what I do. I think it's my vocation, and I'm really happy doing it. And I think I would be bored to death, and I would probably get sick very quickly if I wasn't doing what I'm doing, because I play, and I've talked to a number of people who have similar patterns that, when you stay active and you stay busy and you're doing things you love, you generate a much greater healthy system that can fight off disease. When you give all that up, as you start to relax, you also start to get sick. So I have no interest in sort of retiring my way into being sick.
You feel good?
So far.
Yeah, you look good. Anything else you want to share?
Remember that we have been challenged many times and we've bounced back at many times. And I think in the long run, people prefer freedom to dictatorship, and they prefer the opportunity to seek salvation over being oppressed by atheism.
Amen. Amen. Well, listen, thank you so much for being our guest today. It was an honor speaking with you and sharing with you your life and your hope and your goals.
I'm honored to be with you.
Amen. Thank you.